Thank you very much, Henry, for inviting me. And I begin with a topic which two people from this town inspired me to do. One was Richard Stites, late Richard Stites from Georgetown, and another was Peter Reddaway. We discussed this problem many, many years ago at the Association of American Slavic Studies. It was in Philadelphia, I remember, and both Peter and Richard told me that you should be very careful with your idealization of American studies, and because I was initially trained as Americanist, and think about KGB influences and the special role of post-Soviet immigration to the United States and Canada. So, in this thing in mind, I decided to write my new project, and I realized that KGB and other intelligence agencies from Soviet Union were not just interested in collecting information from United States. As you remember, the United States was major adversary of Soviet Union, but also to influence audience in United States, especially not only in politics, but also in academic studies, in studies of, in centers of Slavic studies, Sovietology studies, and so on. And I was surprised that in one of my files from 1986, KGB mentioned Peter Reddaway as CIA agent. So it's interesting that KGB began collecting files for all directors of Canon. They didn't care especially for Wilson Center, but from 1975 they began representing all major leaders of Canon Institute directors as KGB related, CIA related people. So that's how my presentation connected to Peter Reddaway, because Peter Reddaway was one of the major characters of the 1986 and 1987 files from KGB. I started as a researcher of KGB operation, but I realized that another organization, another agency was more proficient, more efficient, and predecessor of KGB operation in America, and was GRU, G-R-U, Главное разведывательное управление, major military intelligence, which was created before NKVD, and which Trotsky supervised to some extent. The first agents which were sent to the United States represent this organization, not NKVD, not GPU or KGB. And they were very, very efficient in their efforts to not only to collect information, but also to influence American audience. The most scandalous case, the most infamous case was case of Zelman Lipman, who represented Jewish Polish community in Southern California in 1837, who was admitted to University of Southern California, Los Angeles, and who was an agent, an officer of GRU, and who created the most efficient cell in this university, 100 students and faculty. He became a member of faculty of this. Eventually, he fled because of FBI investigation in 1945 back to the Soviet Union. But it was one of major cases of these Soviet intelligence influences, because major goal of Lipman was influence local students, local professors in California, using their sympathy for Soviet Union. Actually, in special instructions, secret instructions of KGB from 1969, 78 and 83, major goal of operatives in America was to find those American professors of Russian history who were sympathetic for Soviet Union, who shared a positive view of Soviet accomplishments in politics, in economy, in culture. And a major goal for Soviet intelligence officers was to support such teachers of Russian history, Slavic studies. At the same time, they had advice to attack Ukrainian nationalists in Slavic studies in Canada and United States, and using more moderate people like Emilian Pritsak, for example, from Harvard, against so-called Banderovцы nationalist group from these Slavic centers. In 1983, we have the first recommendation, and I will talk about this a few minutes more, about using not just Americans or Canadians who taught Soviet, Russian studies, Ukrainian studies, but also to use those immigrants from Soviet Union, from Soviet space, especially Russians, who fled to the West and could be used for these purposes. So today we will discuss siloviki and Soviet Russian intelligence in the past and present. And I must admit that nothing changed after collapse of the Soviet Union. With new agencies, FSB, Служба внешней разведки, GRU, it's the same. We have the similar approaches to infiltrate Western academia, centers for Slavic studies, and influence both American teachers of Soviet history, and those immigrants who could be vulnerable because they have families in Russia or have some connection and so on. So as a result, for example, KGB and GRU tried to use the major cover organizations for their operations targeting Western scholars, specialists in Slavic studies in post-Soviet space. One of them was created under very important influence of both agencies, GRU and KGB, called that Discussion Club. Sounds familiar? From 2004. And they had special expert lists targeting those people who were involved in this discussion. Actually, major goal of this organization, it's on their website, to engage Western scholars in a dialogue and promote Russian interests. Another organization is the Ruski Mir Foundation, created in 2007 by Vyacheslav Nikonov, who worked for KGB, who is son of KGB officer, who is the grandson of Molotov. And Nikonov was the most efficient in the Ruski Mir Foundation for funding those immigrants who came from Moscow, from Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and who could be used for these operations. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the West, and especially the Western exodus of the former Soviet scholars to the West, especially the United States and Canada, became very important picture for a backdrop for these Russian intelligence operations. According to my research, the demographic model of this exodus was completely the same as the demography of the academic exchange between the Soviet Union and the West during the détente and afterwards. In both cases, in the 70s and 80s, Soviet visiting academic programs and the post-Soviet academic emigration after 1981, we observed the same patterns. More than 70% of both Soviet visitors and post-Soviet migrants came from the ruling Soviet political elites. And more than 80% of them represent only one city of the Soviet geopolitical space, Moscow. I studied all centers of Slavic studies in Canada and the United States. Between 1991 and 2005, the overwhelming majority, 85% of post-Soviet academic migration to the United States, at least, was Russian by origin. If we add the number of those Soviet Russian academics who settled in the United States before 1991, we will have a growing Russian academic diaspora in the West, especially in the United States and Canada. More than 80% of the diaspora in the West consists of Muscovites, the residents of Moscow. A former KGB officer from Kiev, who is very anti-Putin now, noted, after 91, Russians dominated the entire post-Soviet academic immigration to America. And the Russian residents from the city of Moscow, those Russian chmo, and use this abbreviation. Do you know what chmo means? Человек Москвы и Московской области. It was old military term which became very popular among ordinary people in 60s, 70s. Prevailed. In Canada and the United States, 2 from 3 post-Soviet immigrants were chmo from Moscow. Plus, we need to include a role of female chmo immigrants who imposed their pro-Russian view on their American husbands, unquote. Another colleague of this guy, whom I criticize for his participation in these KGB operations during his American travels, explained to me that he had to do this because his family life depended on this, but he noted that majority of those people whom he met were his Moscow colleagues. Eventually, they immigrated to the United States and Canada, where either KGB agents or KGB officers. They had pogony KGB, according to his words. But now those Muscovites have their American jobs, teaching at various Canadian and American universities, and they distance themselves from Putin. At the same time, they're afraid to criticize Russian political regime, having their families and close friends still living in Moscow. And continue on and on and on. I have plenty of these interviews in my new book about these operations. What I need to mention, again, I refer to my conversation with Richard Stites and Peter Reddaway, that be careful with Russian migration. How one of these KGB officers mentioned, frankly speaking, now those Muscovites in the Western academia, especially in the field of Slavic studies, play a role of the fifth column of Putin regime in the West. According to my research and FBI investigations, we have plenty of cases of this participation of Russian immigrants who had dual citizenship in anti-American operation against American academia. The most famous name is Yelena Branson Chernych, whose actually goddaughter was arrested a few days ago by FBI for promoting pro-Russian interests in American academia, including this beautiful town. We know this case about Professor Morozov from Tartu University, and I can go on and on. It's not just a case of academic interests. Yelena Branson Chernych was greater supporter of Tulsi Gabbard. And you can find this information everywhere. In 2020, she sponsored presidential campaign of Tulsi Gabbard. And unfortunately, Branson fled, and we still had no clue how these immigrants influenced not only American academia, but also American politicians. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for having me. And to build on the previous presentation topic, I'm actually one of those few apparently Russian immigrants who came from St. Petersburg, not Moscow. But Peter Reddaway wrote a lot about how Russian transition unraveled, and early on he identified a lot of the original sins that in a lot of ways made Putin and rhetoricization and all the horrible things that we are witnessing today possible. So in that sense, my today's presentation builds on this legacy also to demonstrate some of the original problems that haunted the Russian transition from the start, but also putting it in the comparative perspective. So the focus of the presentation is on the role of the political elites, and it introduces a novel data set that we built with assistance of several talented students from Georgetown University and my colleague Kirill Petrov, who currently is the Kazakh University of Kyiv. Now, like, I think the question is self-explanatory. Why do we want to understand the role of the political elites? Clearly, in the context of our region, they're highly consequential. It suffices to say that the war in Ukraine 2022 would not have probably begun if it wasn't for Putin. But it's also important to build this broader understanding into the comparative literature that has consistently demonstrated that, first of all, politicians, who they are, where they come from, is highly influential for the political outcome. And there is a lot of literature in that regard that goes beyond Russia or post-Soviet region alone to focus, for example, on countries like the United Kingdom and so on. Even more important, perhaps, is the role of the closed-off network. So the elites do not operate in the vacuum, but they bring with themselves a set of practices that keep reproducing as long as the same sort of elites are in power. In the context of Russia, for example, when we speak of the elites, there is a notion of krugovaya poruka, the collective responsibility, essentially the kleptocratic network that once you in, sort of provides you forgiveness of all the sins you're allowed to do, no matter what horrible things. As long as you're part of the system will protect you. And the important thing that once you have the reproduction of particular type of elite and power, those sort of practices and set of tools, they get reproduced with them. Last but not the least, the growing literature on the role of the elites have focused on the elite cohesion, specifically how strong the extensive patronage networks that the elites reproduce are. That is typically can be codified by looking at the nature of the elites, the similarity across them. And that, as the argument went, actually is very helpful for autocratic regimes to sustain themselves because once you have like this fairly homogeneous group of people, it's easier to rule them. It's easier to solve many of the collective action problems that you do not have in the situation of elite fragmentation or differentiation. Now, how does this apply in the context of Russia? Well, when it comes to the case of today's Russia, many of you experts clearly familiar with the literature know that much of the analysis has focused on the role of the siloviki background. The previous presentation was one example of it. Clearly, Putin himself, coming from the KGB, is very consequential for the turns and twists in Russian politics. In the early 1990s, the focus has also been on the degree of continuity of the post-Soviet Russian elites with the Soviet elites known as nomenklatura. This literature, pioneered by Vaslensky, among others, has shown that this very narrow group of people who, during the Soviet times, represented maximum up to 3% of the Soviet population, including their families. In more contemporary studies, actually, such as Olga Krushanovsky and others, actually show that it was more like less than 1% of the entire society. They actually tended to reproduce themselves in the post-Soviet Russia and many other countries of the region. The literature has demonstrated that in the Russian case, the degree of continuity has been particularly pronounced. Up to 80% of the Russian political elite members had the origin in the Soviet elites in the early 1990s. Now, why would that matter? Why would we want to focus and understand the elites? Well, some circumstantial evidence and early studies that focus on this question have shown that, in principle, the more elites with nomenclature ties you have in power, the less democratic a given polity is. Can be obviously phenomenal to other issues, but nonetheless, the correlation is pretty clear. Like when the countries like the Baltics, you had larger turnover, they're more democratic. In Central Asian states, you have less turnover, they were less democratic. Accordingly, we can argue that there was something about these types of elites, like nomenclature, that helped the autocrats who were political leaders who popped up across the post-Soviet space, many of them with direct ties to nomenclature themselves, many less so, like Lukashenko, for example, is not the nomenclatura guy, technically speaking, but nonetheless, he sort of reproduced the same part. It is possible there was something about specifically the nature of these elites that helped these wannabe autocrats consolidate control. Accordingly, in cases where we have higher nomenclature persistence, we are supposed to be more likely to see high levels of radicalization or less democratic qualities, and neo-patrimonialism, which refers specifically to this type of the elite networks, organization of power through patronage and kleptocratic sort of behavior. However, there's obviously a lack of data. This question has not been studied. The elites in general is a tough topic. It's not like they're giving out the information about them easily. Accordingly, together with my colleagues, we have addressed this problem by building our own data set of post-Soviet elites, expanding beyond Russia into all of the 15 states. The principle is based on the positional approach. We claim, partly, of course, that simplicity, that there is something about the status in the political system, the formal appointments, that actually communicates power. We can argue to what extent that's applicable. You can see actually quite a strong degree of correlation between their positions and the status in the reputational lists that are also composed across the region. And based on this principle, we have identified a list of about 30 positions that are slightly different for whether the system was presidential or parliamentary, right? There's also this extra added angle. The argument is that in parliamentary systems, the legislature will be a little bit more influential and important than in the presidential systems. You see that the variation, like the differences, are flagged in red. And apologies for the small font. They have the draft in case you're interested in reading this. Beyond sample one, you can argue that's a little bit discretionary. We also have robustness check the sample two, in which case we actually selected the identical positions for presidential and parliamentary systems to make sure that the results hold. And for sample three, we identified the list of 13 key positions of power. Maybe they're the ones that really matter, like who are the core decision makers in the political system. Maybe they're the ones who have strong impact. And based on this principle, we composed the data, collected the data for 3 waves across all of the 15 states, starting 1994, 2002, 2010. How did we code the nomenclature ties? We had, first of all, nomenclature is notoriously opaque and deliberately so. The Soviet system did not want to disclose the internal functionings. By the way, the same is true of China today. But based on the scholarly understanding of the problem, we identify the individuals who worked in Soviet administrative positions in various institutions. Typically, those positions would imply certain management skills and require the approval of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Among them, we have looked at the top cream of the crop of the nomenclature, typically Republican or top-level positions in the system, such as minister position. And smaller level guys were identified as 1. You can argue who is the 0. The 0 is everybody else. It's the Soviet intelligentsia, working class groups, proletariat, you name it. The majority of people are actually 0. Just to give you an example, here is Viktor Zubkov, who was briefly Russian prime minister, if you remember him. He is, there's supposed to be actually 2. The first deputy chairman of the Leningrad Regional Executive Committee, pretty was important. And the Yevtushenkov, sorry, I messed up a little bit the numbers. He is the head of science and technology department of the Moscow city government, which was high enough, but not very high for our purposes. Both of them preserved a high status in post-Soviet Russia. So what do we find out? How does these positions of power, the reproduction of the nomenclature groups in post-Soviet elites, how do they correlate with democracy indicators? So first of all, that's the broader dynamic. You see the 4 waves on the y-axis, 1994, 2002, and 2010. And the top, the x-axis refers to the share of the nomenclature groups in power. You see that, first of all, there's quite a lot of variation, right? You see on this smaller, on the right side of the scale, fewer groups include Estonia, the Baltics, but also Georgia and Armenia, and Ukraine, but also many of the Central Asian states are on the left side of the spectrum. In addition, you see that over time there's a lot of transition to the right side, which predictable, partly is just natural passing of those elites, but there's also clearly a degree of continuity. The countries that start fairly heavy on nomenclature, they sort of maintain this position, and countries like the Baltic states, for example, right, they started already at a very relatively low number, and they essentially the number shrinks even further. There are instances of the transient state, like Ukraine, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, where they started at fairly large numbers, but for different reasons. I would argue, like Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, typically color revolutions, they actually decreased the number of the elites. And last but not the least, we then correlate these results to the actual democracy indicators. The democracy indicators were drawn from the known data sets of democracy, VDEM, Polity, and Freedom House. So first of all, you see that, good for us, the nomenclature is fairly correlated across all three of our samples, and correlated with the democracy indicators in the way that you would expect theoretically, mostly negative and positive with the neo-patrimonialism and indicators where larger number actually means more autocratization. Last but not the least, we also do the regression showing, essentially looking at the actually the degree of significance of this correlation. And what do we find out is that at least the first two samples are quite neatly correlated with lower levels of democracy in a specific, even when controlling for the starting level of democracy. So this is just the variation that explains very little change, already accounting for the starting level of democracy. Still, nomenclature tells us something, and that something suggests that there's definitely negative impact. The VDM indicators are particularly well correlated. You see the positive association, for example, with neo-patrimonialism, less good results for polity, and mixed results for Freedom House indicators, where the correlation is only significant for civil liberties. For whatever reasons, we have to think about it. But altogether, it seems that nomenclature matters even today, with all the imperfections of our data set and the fact that we can't account for many other factors. We do see that even when controlling for lower levels of starting levels of democracy, nomenclature seems to have a very negative effect on democracy. Russia is an outlier, even across the data set of the Central Asian states. Russia has a remarkable degree of reproduction of nomenclature-tied elites. So that tells us something interesting, and also suggests that Peter Reddaway did predict a lot of interesting patterns that we see still today. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So now we'll have Chris Walker. Again, for people who are walking in late, we have biographies in the handouts.
So I'd like, first of all, to thank Henry Hale and the IRIS team for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here and participate in an event that recognizes a formidable scholar who really has shaped so much of the thinking today. And I think one of the things that struck me looking at Peter Reddaway's scholarship and accomplishments, unfortunately, I didn't know him well. I knew him only through brief introductions by Robert Ortung over the years. But it's clear that he was someone that dedicated a good deal of work and focus to human rights and dissidents, which is central to the work of the National Endowment for Democracy, where I work. And I might focus on this element of his accomplishment to make a larger point about where we find ourselves today. I'd contend that the human rights community was critical and out front on seeing what was really going on in Russia before anyone else. And so now we find ourselves 25 years into Vladimir Putin's rule, and in the backdrop we have 25 years of systematic decimation of civil society, independent media, political parties, strategic industry, and the list goes on in ways that the audience for this event understands extremely well. It's worth noting that the human rights community in China played a similar role. The business community led the charge in China. It was the human rights community who I think was speaking more lucidly and candidly as early as the mid-1990s, certainly around the time of the Beijing Olympics. And similarly in China, most intensively since 2012, things have really become much more repressive. It's worth noting that the relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin intensified in 2012 when Putin returned to the Kremlin after the 4 years of Dmitry Medvedev's placeholder in that role, far more belligerent, far more repressive. And so we've had both of these leaders operating now for a dozen years in a very different context that plays out not only within their own country's borders, but beyond them. And so I think Peter Reddaway's voice and insights should have been heeded by more people earlier on, and we'd probably find ourselves in a better place today. So to make the larger point, in a sense, I'm going to build a little bit on Sergei Zhuk and Maria Snegovaya's observations, talk a little bit about some of the work we've done. And that is to say, if we were here 25 years ago, in 1999, right as Vladimir Putin was about to ascend to paramount power, we'd be hard-pressed to find too many people who would say Russia would have meaningful media profile and posture and influence in the Spanish language in Latin America, or that they would have meaningful influence in the Sahel in Africa or in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, or in the Arabic language in the Middle East, which they do and have for quite some time. It isn't simply in the geographic space in closest proximity to the Russian Federation where the Russian language is still used so well. Take a moment to acknowledge one other person who is prescient, and perhaps it was Peter Reddaway's influence, but Robert Ortung and his colleagues here were doing research on RT's influence in the Spanish and Arabic languages way before anyone else was doing this, and they were ahead of the curve to see where we are today. There was way too much complacency, in my view, in the community and the democracies about the impact of this kind of influence. I focus on the media, but it's also true, Sergei Zhuk alluded to Ruski Mir. This is I think the entire package today of Russian influence is hitting us in ways that very few people anticipated. And one point in this context that I would emphasize, in the 1990s through much of the 2000s, the typical framing for much of this influence with the post-1989, post-1991 zeitgeist was this was soft power. It was engagement in spheres that were the vehicles and forms of exerting influence, but the effects of this influence were not to attract or even persuade. And I would contend that what we see today through the vast, multifaceted influence instruments exerted by the Russian state and the Chinese state today are something different. We've made the case that these are more likely to be exerting the effects of the monopolization of ideas, the suppression of alternative narratives, and the exploitation of partner institutions, which in the main are not consistent with attraction persuasion that's typically associated with soft power. And one could argue further that the systematic application of these more corrosive, anti-pluralistic, anti-democratic forms of influence are actually exerting themselves at scale, not only in places one might imagine, but there's some very good research that Ryan Berg at CSIS has done that contends that China's influence, for example, and I suspect this is true for Russia in some way as well, has really had an impact in Latin America democracy writ large by virtue of its systematic application across media, the academic community, where both Russia and China are quite active, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, in ways that's understudied today. And so I'll conclude by saying that it's very hard to imagine in an era of globalization, this now very mature, formidable exertion of influence globally that's projected from Moscow today, changing in the absence of more respect for human rights, democratic accountability domestically in Russia. To the extent the economy becomes weaker or resources shrink, it won't be investments or schools and hospitals in today's Russia that are retained. It'll be investments in political warfare and information warfare that get privileged. And so I think in the absence of meaningful change, more accountability for the principal decision makers in the country, it's very hard to imagine meaningful change globally. That's why we should support human rights and democratic accountability in the way that Peter Reddaway privileged. And it's important not only for Russian citizens to have a better, more prosperous future, but for all of us. And so thanks very much for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this event.
Lot to discuss informally. We'll have another coffee break and then a lunch reception after everything. But I do want to start out the second panel. And to start us off, we're going to have a video presentation by someone very close to Peter who could not be here but really wanted to contribute. And so that's Robert Van Voren of the Andrei Sakharov Research Center. And the video is entitled Peter Reddaway's Crucial Role in Combating Soviet Psychiatric Abuse, which will set the stage for our discussion on dissidents past, present, and maybe future. And so we're going to play the video now, and then Ivan Grek, head of our Russia program here at GW, will chair the discussion, starting with Peter Rolberg, then myself and Polina Protozanova, and Irina Olimpieva. So I think we can go ahead and roll the video.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be able to say a few words. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be able to say a few words to you about Peter Reddaway and his role in the fight against the political abuse of psychiatry. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to join you today for reasons of not being able to travel to the United States at this moment. I'm elsewhere. But the fight against political abuse of psychiatry and Peter's role in this is too important to miss. And so I would like to take just a few minutes of your time. I will put on a PowerPoint presentation in order to be able to give you some of a historical background. So Peter Reddaway really has been, I would say, the founding father of the fight against political abuse of psychiatry. He started this very early on. Those who are not familiar about the political abuse, this is a practice that started already in the 1940s, but really became mainstream when Yuri Andropov in 1967 became director of the KGB, the secret police of the Soviet Communist Party. And when Andropov decided that fight against the internal enemy was one of his key issues, and he is actually the one who turned this into a systematic use of psychiatry to get rid of political opponents. Are figures of the organization that Peter actually helped to found, the International Association on the Political Use of Psychiatry, which is now called the Federation Global Initiative on Psychiatry, was that about 1/3 of dissidents would wind up in psychiatric hospital rather than in camp or prison. But I found documents in the archives of the Stasi in East Berlin, which indicate that, according to their figures, probably every second dissident had this fate. So, for me, this is a photo which symbolizes the political abuse of psychiatry completely. This is Leonid Plyush, Ukrainian dissident who spent 4 years in the special psychiatric hospital in Dnipropetrovsk, now Dnipro, was released after an intervention by the French communist leader Georges Marchais, and basically straight from the psychiatric hospital was transferred to Paris. And you can see him sitting here on this photo, and he hardly understands what is happening around him. He was completely drugged with aminazine, haloperidol, mayectil. And unfortunately, the institution where he was is still there. I have been on the inside several times, and I regrettably need to tell you that the situation has not very much changed. So as I said, Peter was really key in documenting the abuse, in putting it on the agenda. He had been involved from a very early start in supporting the human rights movement in the Soviet Union. We see here on a photo with the Dutch professor and journalist Karel van der Dreven, his wife, and also Elizabeth Fischer, who in 1968 already established the Herzen Foundation, which focused on translating and publishing dissident literature in the West, but also in creating so-called tamizdat, printing it in small booklets and then smuggling it back into the Soviet Union. And later, very influential in this area was Ed Klein, an entrepreneur from New York who spent most of his time and money in publishing publications that had to go back into the Soviet Union, like the Charlitze publications, Chronica Press. This was all something that Ed Klein was doing. So Peter Reddaway is the author of two big books that he published together with Sidney Bloch, a Australian-based psychiatrist who worked for a while in Britain. The first one came out in the 1970s, Russia's Political Hospitals, which really documented the abuse fundamentally, and then later they published Soviet Psychiatric Abuse as part of the campaign to force the World Psychiatric Association to expel the Soviets from the organization because of the ongoing systematic political abuse of psychiatry. In 1980, we decided to establish a temporary organization that would coordinate the campaigns against the political abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet Union, with the focus of getting them out of the World Psychiatric Association. You see here a photo of the founding meeting in Paris on the left, and then on the right, one of the first photos of a meeting in 1981. You will see that I was probably the youngest kid on the block with my long hair, and Peter is standing there right in the middle. And at the bottom, you see one photo of one of the planning meetings before the World Psychiatric Conference in Athens, where the Soviets were trying to come back into the WPA. And Peter Reddaway is the one sitting the closest to the photographer. So Peter was incredibly active in this regard. He organized meetings. We have here photos of him with Ed Klein, with General Pyotr Grigorenko, one of the victims of political abuse of psychiatry. This was a meeting in London where he defended Vyacheslav Bakhmin, one of the members of the Moscow-based working group to investigate the use of psychiatry for political purposes, who eventually spent 4 years behind bars. And on the left, I have a photo of one of the information bulletins that we were putting out. So Peter was really the key in bringing together all the information that people were bringing back from the Soviet Union, from careers like myself, like the people that eventually worked for me, the people students that he engaged in this. And he was the one who was constantly using this information in order to develop strategies that we would then discuss at the board meetings of this international association in order to decide how to proceed and how to obtain the release of political prisoners from psychiatric hospitals, but also how to force the world psychiatric community to acknowledge that this abuse took place and that they had a moral obligation to tackle this. Peter, being an academic, much more an academic than myself, was an extremely moral person who could not accept any of these abuses and really dedicated all his time to combat this and to convince people that they had a moral obligation to counter this. And so I got to know Peter Reddaway in 1978. I was, as I said, the youngest kid on the block. I was 18 years. And via Vladimir Bukovsky, I got in touch with him. And Peter was really my mentor who slowly but surely pulled me into this business, you could say. From 1980 onwards, I became a career. I was first one of his careers, then I established my own group of careers. And eventually we had a network of several of these coordinators that brought back information from the Soviet Union, and we shared it amongst each other. And then together we, developed the plans how to take this further. So continuous involvement in campaigns against the political abuse of psychiatry. These are photos of the 5th Sakharov Conference. This is 1986. It's in Amsterdam. 1986, the beginning of the change, because Gorbachev came to power. This is 1 month after Gorbachev came to power, when nobody believed actually that something was going to change and that it was all kind of nonsensical what Gorbachev was saying. In 1989, Peter Reddaway took part in this US delegation to the Soviet Union. This was a delegation led by Professor Lauren Roth from Pittsburgh that tried to assess the status as far as political abuse of psychiatry is concerned. They toured the country, came to the conclusion eventually that the abuse was still continuing, that there were still people for political reasons in psychiatric hospitals who had no mental illness. On the left-hand side, there is a photo of them in Chernihiv. In the middle, you see a Russian guy. This is Viktor Fukalov, who was the new director of the Special Psychiatric Hospital in Chernihiv, who was completely different. I later worked with him for 8 years in the Special Psychiatric Hospital in Chernihiv. He later told me a lot about this visit, and one of the funniest part is that so on the far left there is Alan Mercer, who was then Director of International Affairs of the American Psychiatric Association, and so Fukalov was all the time keeping her away from the walls because Moscow had sent a lot of paint to the hospital in order to paint the walls so it looked much better. But the paint had been put up just the day before the visit, and so he wanted to avoid that Ella Mercer got the paint on her clothes. We remained in touch for many, many years, actually to the very end. Peter was always engaged in the work that we were doing. In the Soviet Union, the political abuse of psychiatry came to an end in 1990, 1991. I went further in trying to reform mental health care services in the region. We remained in touch looking at the developments in the region, and then of course with the ascent of Putin, with increasing worry about the direction that Russia was taking. And later, at the beginning of this decade, we started moving Peter Reddaway's library and also half of his archive to the Andrei Sakharov Research Center for Democratic Development that I lead in Kaunas in Lithuania, which is really a center that tries to capture the past, to document what happened in the past, and to salvage the archives of people like Peter Reddaway, because future generations really need this material in order to understand this period. Because as we see now, the Soviet Union is not gone. It's all around. It's reactivated in a different format. In a way, I think, even in a more nasty format. And so the work of Peter Reddaway will really help future generations in order to understand the basis of what is happening right now. As I said, political abuse of psychiatry in Russia is back. We worked on this with Peter Reddaway. He read the reports. For him, of course, very upsetting to see at the end of your life that seemingly all the work that you have put in this is in vain. I would say it's not in vain, because we also managed to educate a lot of psychiatrists in the region. There are countries in the region where this political abuse is not taking place, where moral standards, ethical norms have been accepted in psychiatry, where people stand up and voice their opinions and demonstrate. During COVID, we had the first demonstration of psychiatrists in Kiev who demonstrated against government plans, which I think is really a big feat. But of course, the sad thing is that in Russia, everything has been sliding back. and this is a report that we just put out 2 weeks ago. Peter didn't see this. He knew that this direction was, that things were going in this direction, but we really are back to square one with Russia using psychiatry as a systematic means of repressing those who oppose the regime. So really, Peter was, for me, he was a central figure in the more than 45 years that we've known each other. My whole education, my whole mindset, the direction that I took is very much formed by him. But I know that I'm just one out of really dozens, if not hundreds, of people that very much benefited from Peter's knowledge, his wisdom, his morality, and also his modesty, because Peter was an extremely modest person who never, felt himself being standing higher than other people. But he was a giant. He really was a giant. And I think it is very good that you're organizing this event, because he should be remembered. The library of the Andrei Sakharov Research Center in Kaunas will be named after Peter Reddaway, and I hope that his name will not be forgotten and that we can benefit from his wisdom for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Ivan Grek. I'm the director of the Russia program at IRIS, and it's really great to see so many faces here in this demotivating weather. So, actually, I'm originally from St. Petersburg, so, this weather really motivates to speak about Russia a lot. So, today I'm honored to chair a panel on dissidents in Russia, past and present. We'll have Peter Reddaway speaking about dissidents in Russia in general. Then Polina Protazanova and Henry Hale speaking about support for Navalny in the wake of the 2021 protest. And Irina Limpieva will present her research on the current opposition within Russia. So we're short in time, 10 minutes. And so we can have a chance to have a Q&A. And I would like to invite here to the podium Peter Reddaway, who is already here. The George Washington University, as you know.
Thank you so much. So my topic is Peter Reddaway and the ethics of dissidents. I chose this because it seems to me that the one topic that was always associated with Peter's work, apart from many others, was really dissidents, and that the fact that he called his memoirs, The Dissidents, actually shows that this was really central to him. Looking back, he wrote this when he was already in his late 70s. Looking back at the fruits of his work, of decades of work, giving them this name, choosing The Dissidents as the title, really shows how central this notion was for Peter. And to be sure, in the Soviet context, dissidents as a factual phenomenon existed before the 1960s, when Peter actually came on the scene. But it was he who actually led a more unified view of the many different critical approaches toward reality and the ideology of communist society. And this is something that we probably forget today, in what how much resistance actually this view of having a dissident movement in the Soviet Union actually was facing. And Peter had to fight really an uphill battle in this regard. So what he did after he was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1964, he actually was the helping hand. He was the organizer who actually did whatever he could in order to make dissidents realize their vision and speak out and be able to find voices and to find a way of expressing themselves. Today, it's hard to imagine the extent to which Peter Reddaway and a few other of his fellow Western academic observers changed the general image of the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc by defining the dissidents as a distinct, if fluid, movement, as a category, as a behavioral type in the Western mind. After all, when he began to describe the phenomenon of intellectuals who were unwilling to align with the socialist or communist status quo, not just for gradual differences, but for the entire official dogma, for principal reasons, many voices in the West reacted with disbelief. In his memoir, Peter Reddaway mentions the naysayers in the West, such as Harris and Salisbury, for example, who doubted the very existence of dissidents and the authenticity of their texts. The reasons why that is the case, there may be various reasons. One was really that this view of the progress of history from lower slavery, feudal capitalism, socialism, and so on, had sunk in so deeply that even people who were skeptical of the Soviet Union and Soviet reality actually had bought into that, and they could believe that there was an actual real resistance movement. So I want to say that one of the important, interesting factors here is that it all started with literature, with fiction. That's something that has actually been forgotten in recent years, that actually fiction was the field where dissidence was first expressed and was first detected. And so Peter actually, when he joined the university at age 18, which coincided with Nikita Khrushchev and his apex of power and led to his lifelong commitment, as he himself says, to studying, understanding the communist state, as people as leaders, that he was first interested in literature. And he was actually doing research on literature and with his mentor, Leonard Shapiro in London, he actually wrote a master's thesis on literature and also began a PhD project on literature. Max Hayward invited Peter Reddaway to a conference on Soviet literature that was organized at St. Anthony College in Oxford. The master's thesis was Yevtushenko and Kochetev in the Soviet literary struggle since 1956. So things that are now completely forgotten, but in those days they were very much on people's mind. And I want to say that this is actually a replica of what happened in the 19th century in Russia, in that literature was really a field, probably the only field where political struggles, where political discussions could actually take place. Everything else, practical politics, parliamentary politics, was all out. Was simply impossible. And so, very naturally, literature was really the focus of this kind of dissident, quasi-dissident, avant la lettre movement. And then, after this had reached its first apex with One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn, then it all basically moved out of literature. And so in the 1960s, this is interesting, we have this phenomenon of moving from literature, literary studies, viewing dissidents or finding dissidents in literary studies, to general politics, to political, practical, political issues. Peter soon became a chronicler, if not the chronicler, of human rights movement in the Soviet Union, and he agreed with the legalist approach toward dissidents that had been suggested by Yesenin Volpin. In other words, taking the constitution and the laws of the communist state literally and insisting on the rights to express one's opinion and meet openly in public spaces, as it was guaranteed by the laws of the Soviet Union and its Soviet bloc states. And the dominating method of expressing dissent was civil disobedience, not violence. He observed the steady maturation of the dissidents' human rights movement by also enabling the publication of Chronika tekushich событий, Chronicle of Current Events. There were 63 typewritten issues from 1968 to 1983 that he himself helped edit, helped publish, redacted by Natalia Gorbanevskaya, Sergei Kovalyov. Among its authors, I've found was also Zviad Gamzahurdia, the first president of a free Georgia. Peter wrote, "It was evident to me as an outside observer that in the period of my Moscow sojourn from September 1963 to May 1964, Soviet society was moving toward becoming a seedbed for the emergence of samizdat and the expression of public dissent." End quote. In the early 1980s, when this movement of dissidents actually came to its end. The fragile associations that had been created by the dissidents had been fully driven underground. Since the communist state had uncompromisingly rejected any offer from dissidents to cooperate on reforming the shaking colossus, any hope to create the civil society from below seemed to be in vain. Yeah, I want to just say a few things here in a kind of more condensed way. So, one, the dissident movement started with literature. I can't emphasize this enough, with the first culmination point being the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, but then transcended literature radically by moving into practical politics, human rights, and so on and so on. Peter did not adopt the value system of classical Russian literature, which is interesting because he was so open-minded, so tolerant, and so accepting of Russian intellectual history, but he did not adopt the value system of classical Russian literature with its moral maximalism, and he did not view idealistic intelligentsia as the norm-generating societal stratum. Instead, he chose to remain within the moral framework of human rights of the British and Western tradition. This reduced the attractive idealism, maximalism of many dissident worldviews to the mere legal essence, but it also widened the scope of the movement as a whole, as it incorporated a variety of approaches that were incompatible with each other. Number three, within this framework, Peter recognized that each dissident was different from the other by personality, biography, political, cultural profile. The only thing that all dissidents have in common was their principal disagreement with the Soviet communist society or with certain aspects thereof, political, cultural, religious, and so on. Number four, Peter Reddaway resisted the tendency to create a hierarchy of dissenters. Indeed, any kind of dissent, regardless how close to or how distant from it was with respect to his own worldview, all dissident views were worthy of respect and protection, which is, I think, a very British approach, if you might call it this way. All dissidents' views were worthy of respect and protection. It's remarkable how he repeatedly grouped nationalist, conservative, democratic figures together. Number five, Peter Reddaway's work helped define the identity of an initially amorphous phenomenon, the dissidents, a movement whose members' positions were often incompatible with each other. By insisting on their right to think, speak, write in their own individual way, he helped strengthen the dissidents' self-confidence and sense of legitimacy. Number six, he also created a norm of right to dissent in the West, resisting and rejecting any trend toward a narrow, normative view of democracy. Dissidents meant to stand with the individual or the minority against the majority or a majority, regardless of the ideological reasoning behind it. And finally, number seven, already in the 1990s, when taking stock of the dissident movement, which effectively had ended with the 1985 perestroika, Peter began to relativize its significance on a sociological scale compared to other expressions of discontent within the Soviet system. He wrote an investigation of all the dissident groups and movements from 1960 to 1985, when they were the only outlet for public discontent and its transmitter to the outside world. One can yield only partial answers. Although the dissidents were successful in providing verbal expression and a rational framework for much of this sentiment, their pronouncements were only one important element in the broader landscape of public opinion. Many Soviet citizens who were profoundly resentful or suspicious of the authorities simply did not consider this dissident type of behavior as a rational or feasible response to the perversities of the system. I want, if I have a minute, I just want, okay, thank you. I want to mention that Peter actually also made a point of remaining an independent thinker and judge also of phenomena after basically the dissidents phenomenon was over. So one case that struck me, I mean, there were several also here at GW, for example. He actually worked and appeared as a fearless a champion of certain norms, but one thing that he was really very keen about was to keep the field of Sovietology clean of those who dishonored it. So in 2012, Peter wrote together with Stephen Cohn about a British historian, I won't mention the name, who had anonymously published negative reviews of colleagues' books on Amazon, and to make things work, positive reviews about his own books, also anonymously. That historian misrepresented facts. Interviewees who had been inmates of gulags themselves and whose relatives had. So Peter actually wrote this article in The Nation, and it was later republished by the Moscow Times. And he wrote there, "For us, longtime students and friends of victims of Stalinist and other Soviet-era repressions, the book's defects are especially grave. For many Russians, particularly surviving family members, Stalin's millions of victims are a sacred memory." The historian, whose name I won't mention, has not, to say the least, been faithful to that memory, nor to the truth-telling mission of the often politically embattled Memorial, which, despite the efforts expended, honorably agreed to the decision against publishing the book of this historian in Russian. Still more, a great many Russians have suffered, even died, for freedom to speak the truth. So I want to say that Peter's legacy is actually one of independence of judgment, independence of and freedom of judgment in the way that he has, on the one hand, practiced it with the Soviet dissidents, and also later on in his own daily life, in his life as an academic, as a life as a public intellectual. And so that is something we should remember and that we should honor him for. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now the presentation by Henry Hale and Polina Protazanova.
All right, thank you, everyone. What we're going to present now will be some preliminary research. It's a project that we've been working on, but only at the very initial stages. But we thought, since the theme is very relevant to this conference, and in particular to Peter's work on dissidents, we thought that we would share our thoughts at this point with you. So it's collaboration between myself and Polina Protazanova. So she'll start out presenting it, and then I'll finish up. Just try to keep it microphone close.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Hi again, my name is Polina. Today, Henry and I will be presenting our preliminary research on popular support for Navalny after his 2021 arrest. The questions we're asking here are quite simple, which are what kinds of people supported Navalny, and perhaps more broadly, what opposition appeals seem capable of generating popular support in contemporary Russia. Before we get into the results, it's important to talk about the survey design. So this study is quite different from the previous ones because they have been unable to capture Navalny supporters on a nationally representative survey because actually too few people identified with the opposition. So what we do is we take advantage of the survey timing and, We take advantage of the survey timing and Navalny's peak popularity when he returns from Germany to Russia, and then the consequent protests. So again, this survey takes place from April through May 2021, and what we actually find is that in a question of who would you vote for a president in an upcoming election, actually almost 11% of respondents say Navalny. So this, again, gives us an opportunity to capture demographic correlates of opposition support in contemporary Russia. Before we get into the results, again, I think it's also important to talk about the theoretical reasons of why Navalny emerged by the end of his career as sort of the face of the Russian opposition. And probably the biggest one was his anti-corruption investigations. He, of course, started on Живой Journal, or Life Journal, in mid-2000s, where he primarily blogged about buying small shares of different businesses, which gave him extra information about different Russian companies. And he, at one point, even took Transneft to court. And then in the mid-2010s, he moved his investigations to YouTube, where they really became professional. As of 2024, he has over 6.4 million subscribers. Another base of appeal that I think is also important to talk about are his nationalist leanings at the beginning of his career. So he was, of course, the founder of Narod, or the people in the Russian acronym. And in there, he juxtaposed a couple of different ideals. Some were normal, quote unquote. So he called for real separation of government branches, prioritization of small businesses, but also he combined that with quote-unquote sensible immigration policy, looser gun ownership laws, and also citizenship paths for ethnic Russians. And I think that strategy was strategic, for lack of a better word, because surveys do show that over 50% of Russians do share xenophobic ideas, but in the end, this movement didn't really gain much political traction. And then finally, by 2017, he emerges as the sort of face of Russian opposition. And this leads to an interesting divide in the opposition base, because some people did support him, but some did still remember and disagree with his xenophobic views. But at the same time, he was able to unite all of these people under his one persona as the face, and what one book calls him as the instrument. Because even if people did for the moment disagree with his previous nationalist leanings, he was sort of the face of the Russian opposition and the instrument for the time being, an alternative without alternatives, so to say. And I think even disregarding his political beliefs, he wasn't a difficult person to like. He was quite charismatic and I think had a unique, perhaps subjectively, had a unique skill of uniting internet humor for a bigger political purpose. So just to name a few examples, in his investigation of Medvedev's residency, he made a joke about a house for a little duck, which later became a symbol of 2017 protests. And then in his investigation of Putin's palace, he also made a joke about a so-called mudroom. And that also instigated a lot of mobilization among his base. Now for the results, if Henry would do.
Okay, so a lot of the results won't be terribly surprising, but I think there are some that are interesting here. And so basically what we did was to do a statistical analysis. It's an OLS regression model, and we are looking for factors that are the best predictors of whether somebody, when posed with the question, who would you vote for president of Russia, if the following list of people were on the ballot, and they had a list of some of the main contenders, but also Navalny, who would you vote for? And so it's a predictor of who would vote for Navalny versus any of the alternatives. Of course, most of the alternatives in the survey say Vladimir Putin. This graph illustrates the results. And so basically what it means is that at the bottom is the full effect of a factor. And so that basically means if you take that factor from its minimum value to the maximum, what is the change in the likelihood of voting for Navalny as a result? So, and this line means basically the effect is 0. And the dots are kind of the estimated effect. And these are the 95% confidence intervals. So if the confidence intervals intersect the 0 line, we basically can't conclude that it has any effect. So what we're interested in is the ones where you see a clear effect, where the 95% confidence intervals are clearly outside the realm of 0. So not surprisingly, if we look at demographics here, he has a great appeal among youth, right? But interestingly, Russian Orthodox figures, people who identify with the Russian Orthodox Church, also are less likely to say they vote for him. Women are actually somewhat less likely to vote for him, but that probably reflects the fact that women have traditionally in Russia been more supportive of Putin than not. But I think more interesting are some of the next factors, which look at different values that people expressed in the survey. And the survey was conducted by the University of Oslo, specifically looking at the role of traditional values in Russian politics. So it has a lot of questions about that we are able to exploit. So just to run through the things, very interestingly enough, people that said they thought old people played too much of a role in politics, that doesn't seem to be a predictor of support for Navalny. So the generational change argument doesn't quite seem to be what was driving that support. But when people were asked, which period of Russian history do you think best exemplified your values? The people that chose the 1990s are quite a bit more likely, over 20% more likely to say they would have voted for Navalny. So it doesn't seem to matter whether people said they favored a strongman leader Anti-corruption, at least as expressed in the survey, doesn't seem to matter, probably because most people are not for corruption, and Putin supporters overlook it in his case or don't think he's doing it. Interestingly enough, people who thought that Russia was part of European civilization, which is not a totally negligible share of the population at this time, were more likely to vote for Navalny, but just by a little bit. But by far the biggest effect was people who expressed liberal values in Russia. And so there's a whole battery of 13 different questions of different forms of social liberalism. And people who said yes on all of these kind of liberal values were over 60% more likely to say they would vote for Navalny. Anti-migrant sentiment doesn't seem to really be a factor here, nor does kind of racism. So he does seem to have overcome that, although there is some weak evidence of a small effect. And so just to break it down very briefly, what the liberal values are, we see that they're all correlated with the likelihood of voting for Navalny, including support for sex equality. So, men and women should share duties in the home or family. Tolerance for LGBTQ plus communities, a big predictor of support for Navalny. Personal liberalism, things like, they are personally okay with abortion, and people who express secular views, dissociating, saying politics and the state, religion and the state should be separated. So, okay, maybe liberalism isn't a huge factor in Russian politics today, but in fact, according to this index, if we look at the broad range of questions, this is the distribution of liberalism across the Russian population. And so what we see is there are pretty high percentages of people concentrated in the middle. So these are people who sort of adhere to a number of liberal values, but not others. So it doesn't seem to be a completely empty political space, at least as of 2021. What's happening now, I think, may be changing some of this. But I think we'll just wrap it up there and leave the rest for discussion and turn things over back to the chair.
Thank you so much. And the last presentation by Irina Limpieva.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to be here and to present the outcomes of our research on Russia. And my today's presentation will be about Russian civil society, which most experts on Russia after the beginning of the war with Ukraine consider as dead. So my aim today is to show that the situation is far more complex, and in order to understand, what should I press here? In order to understand more, to get more comprehensive understanding of the impact of war on Russian civil society, we need to look at it at least from two different perspectives. So the one perspective is institutionalization, but by which I mean the degree of to what extent civic initiatives are organized, formalized, and incorporated into the institutional fabric of the society. And from this perspective, on one edge of this spectrum, we will have a big, well-established nonprofit organizations. On the other edge are grassroots, non-formalized, informal initiatives which operate more like networks than organizations. And another dimension is politicization that has to do with the agenda of these initiatives, and specifically to what extent they are aimed on promoting democratic values, opposing authoritarian regime, and etc. So on the one edge of this axis, we will have human rights organizations, various kinds of political opposition to Putin regime, and on the other edge, we will see organizations that aimed at various social issues, solving various social problems, and that serve more like service organizations. And at the intersection of these two dimensions, we see four segments of civil society that after the beginning of the war with Ukraine demonstrate quite different dynamics and sometimes even opposite dynamics. Oh, sorry. So the first sector, institutionalized and politicized, include the most prominent civil society organizations like human rights, anti-corruption, independent liberal press, and etc. And after beginning of the war, this sector was almost destroyed, and the leaders of this sector were either imprisoned or in exile or just murdered, as Alexei Navalny. So when Western experts claim that civil society in Russia is dead, they are first of all referring to this sector of Russian civil society. Institutionalized, not politicized organizations include various NGOs that aim at different social issues. And after beginning of this war, this sector was also under attack, and many organizations, especially those branches of big international groups, were announced foreign agents, undesirable organizations, and had to leave Russia. The loss of international funding was very, painful for this sector. That led to growing dependence on the state and increase of the number of so-called GONGOs, governmental organized non-governmental organizations. And those organizations that remain independent within the sector, they have to use various kinds of adaptation strategies. There are now many studies of how these organizations survive new contexts and new conditions. And interestingly, that while this organized sector of civil society experiences, this decline and almost destroyed, the grassroots activism looks like it's on surge. And according to our studies of anti-war resistance in Russia and some other case studies that we conducted during the recent years, as well as according to the studies of our colleagues from different research centers in Europe and the United States. So we can speak about the surge in anti-war grassroots activism, and this new activities appear, such as, for instance, anti-propaganda informational activism that was mushrooming in Telegram and Instagram, YouTube, telling the truth about the war, especially during the first year of the war. Street art, I think that many of you probably know this interesting studies about the street art resistance. Avoiding draft has become also a widespread anti-war activism when groups of activists emerged helping draftees to escape from Russia, collecting documents, helping them at the borders, and so on, is providing transportation. Women's anti-war resistance, and here I mean not the big women organizations, but these local groups of mothers or wives of mobilized soldiers that again try to protect their loved ones from mobilization and from the war. Ethnic resistance is also very important, especially in the areas, in the regions with disproportional number of draftees from these regions, like Dagestan, Tuva, Buryatia. We saw this protests against mobilization. So-called solidarity or compassionate protest, when people express their solidarity with Ukrainians, for instance, who were killed during the Russian attacks of Russian forces. And the most interesting, I guess, humanitarian protest, which looks like humanitarian act, but in fact is demonstration or the form of expression of anti-war sentiments. And specifically, we were studying the groups that help Ukrainian refugees who found themselves on Russian territory to get to Europe. And this is a really very interesting study. So, to sum up, Russian civil society is not dead, but it is transforming. And while Russian civil society has lost its role as an institutional player with direct political influence, grassroots civil society remains active and continues to evolve. And it is interestingly that this trend is not new. This discrepancy between dynamics of organized and grassroots civil society we can trace since the beginning, probably of 2000, when many studies revealed growing dependence of civil society organization of the state. And as for politicized organization, so there was a constantly growing political pressure on these organizations, and the law of foreign agents actually marked the beginning of deliberate purge of organized and politicized civil society. At the same time, simultaneously, we see the growth of grassroots activism, and the most probably prominent examples of this activism: garbage protests in Moscow region, at the same in the 10th, landfill protests in Shias, urban planning activism, ecological protests, and various kinds of small local activist initiatives that we see. So now we have this not new but transformed probably sphere of civic activism, which has very specific characteristics. The first, these grassroots initiatives prefer to stay informal. They don't want to formalize, sometimes deliberately. For instance, in our study of this group in Telegram that help Ukrainian refugees, this is a perfectly, brilliantly organized group. It's already an organization, but they deliberately stay informal in order to get out of state radar. So some researchers compare this new form of civil society operating with mycelium, so network structure. Secondly, much activity occurs at the local level, which is often invisible to outsiders and not captured by federal media. The activism moved from the streets where it is it's becoming more and more dangerous to internet. And here we see the role of Telegram, Instagram, other messengers. It is important to mention growing trans-border solidarity. We see in our studies the growing collaboration of Russian activists with international volunteers and relocated Russian activists. Sometimes it is hard to determine where the initiative started and where it is originated. And we also need to understand that alongside with so-called liberal or good civic initiatives, there is an increase of illiberal or bad grassroots activism, and we also can trace it in our research. So various nationalists, pro-war, ultra-right groups that also surge after the beginning of war. And finally, and the most interesting that requires more research, this is characteristic of politicization of grassroots activism. It is very hard to distinguish between politicized and non-politicized activism, grassroots today, because some cases that look as politicized, for instance, I don't know, some protests in Bashkiria to defend Fail Alsinov. But when you take a closer look, when you talk to these people, when you conduct interviews and find out about the motivations and drivers that bring people to the streets, so it looks like it absolutely depoliticized. They try to distance themselves from any politics, and vice versa. As I mentioned already, the case of volunteers helping Ukrainian refugees. This pure humanitarian initiative, in fact, is a way to express the anti-war sentiment and anti-war protest. So, and I will stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. So I'll call our panelists to the chairs. Oh, yeah. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. So please, Ira, can you take the chair as well? Paulina, where are you? I can see you. Yeah, we're waiting you there. Yeah. So, can you pass? Can you pass the mic to Gulnaz Sharafuddinova out there? So, right there. So probably we'll have like 5-7 minutes. We'll collect 3 questions first.
Thank you so much, Ivan. Thank you, panelists. I have a follow-up question to Irina on the concepts and terms. You use the term civil society and civic activism. And it made me think, at which point do we move from civil society and civic activism to dissidents and resistance? The terms that Peter Reddaway used for the Soviet Union. And do these terms matter? Might they matter as an indicators of the shift in the regime that we have been observing? And because the regime changes gradually, we might be using the terms that we used to use, but maybe it's time for new. I think there's something to think about there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great panel. I have 2 questions. First is to Henry and Paulina. Could you talk a little bit about this survey? 11% for Navalny looks like a great achievement. To what extent do you think the survey was representative? Was it run online, where we know the sample is typically biased towards more opposition-minded response? And the second one is to Irina. It's definitely a very welcome effort to track the civil society in Russia, whatever remains of it. But there's a tendency to count as such every tiny little initiative, no matter how small. So I'm missing the numbers. Can you tell me what's your cutoff? Like, if a Telegram channel collects 20 people, is that a evidence of civil group activism that you already count as such? So what is size amount? Unfortunately, if you look on Telegram and track the followers of those groups, we're talking maybe tens, maybe hundreds of people, way below millions of, for example, followers that Z channels collect. Like, where is the numbers? If you could comment on that.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think. My question are for Henry and Paulina. You use the term nationalism and xenophobia almost interchangeably, so I'm curious as to whether or not you see a distinction between the two. And Henry, on the chart, you broke down liberal values, but you did not break down 1990 values, which I found particularly interesting in respect to Navalny's rather pointed diatribe against the 1990s in the summer of 2023. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, can you share the questions to the panel? Do you have a mic? Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for your questions. Gulnaz, regarding these terms, I think and I believe that civil society and civic activism is wider term if you compare with dissidents and resistance, because we look at various kinds of activities, but not only those to oppose the existing political regime. And I don't know where is this point when it turns, but in our studies, we see that this, sometimes we call this activism as resistance. And actually, I have this problem because when I write texts presenting the outcomes of our studies, I always, switch from anti-war resistance, anti-war activism. So this resistance is a very tricky term. But I mean that resistance, if you use this term, when you are sure, absolutely, according to the outcomes of your study, that this is against, so something that is against the war, that this is against the regime. So in this case, we use these terms. So I hope I answer your question. And probably to Maria. So we use qualitative methodology, and that is why we, of course, cannot give the numbers. So how wide is this phenomenon of grassroots activism? And this is probably the main problem. But everything depends on what outcomes and what results you are looking for and you are expecting from this civic activism. If you are looking for political influence of this, so again, so Russian civil society in terms of political influence, direct political influence has been destroyed, yes. But in terms of many other things that civil society matters, so I don't know, educational things. So our respondents, for instance, even those who participated in small protests, they say that the people around us are not the same after doing this. So the effects of this civic activism go beyond this probably political expectations. So they are different. That is why, of course, the numbers matter, but this is not all.
Okay, yeah, so very briefly, the survey was not an online survey, so it was a telephone survey, so conducted by a random sampling of telephone numbers. So I wouldn't expect any particular reason to be, biased any more than any other survey. And on Bob's very interesting questions, I mean, I think the result of the 1990s is particularly interesting, in part for the reason that you describe. And, my initial kind of thought about that is that it reflects how Navalny is increasingly took on qualities as just a symbol of resistance, right? The primary kind of opposition focal point against the regime, kind of more or less independent of a lot of the particular things that he had espoused in the past or present, other than opposition to the regime and democracy. So people who kind of saw the 1990s as their kind of ideal point in Russian history could support him, as could people who held a lot of other values that maybe maybe were dissonant with some of the things that Navalny had expressed over the years. So in any case, we're continuing to work this out. I don't know, Paulina, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Forgive me if I used nationalism and xenophobia as synonymous. I don't think they are. Their scholars conceptualize nationalism as both left-leaning and right-wing. It's just that in the case of Navalny, he specifically used xenophobia to draw up this like us versus them dynamic. And as I mentioned, surveys still show that Russian people are pretty xenophobic towards immigrants from Central Asia. I think over 50% are. So that's what he was using in that case, because it was a strategic, I think, choice. But nationalism doesn't have to be associated with xenophobia per se.
Thank you so much. We have so much to share that we ran out of time as usual. So I invite everyone to continue the conversation at the coffee break. Thank you so much. Let's thank the panel once again.
Hey, greetings, everyone. I think we should go ahead and get the roundtable started. I think first we're going to, what we'll do is we'll show a video contribution by Dmitry Glinsky, one of Peter's co-authors. And so I think that for that, the panelists can sit wherever they want. And then afterwards, we'll ask the panelists, the roundtable members, to join us at the front. And then Peter Rolberg will take over as chair at that point. So let's first start with the video presentation of Dmitry Glinsky.
I am grateful to the organizers of this symposium for including me in their invitation to potential speakers. I could not pass on that offer. I was exceptionally fortunate to work for and with Peter Reddaway for about 5 years. We co-authored 5 articles for such publications as the Journal of Democracy and the Los Angeles Times, as well as 1 book, The Tragedy of Russia's Reforms, Market Bolshevism Against Democracy. It was reviewed by dozens of periodicals from The Economist to The Nation. It was referenced and commented upon by scholars across a range of disciplines, from Joseph Stiglitz to Andrei Glucksmann, and some say has not yet been consigned to oblivion. Reflecting on our work and its impact is at once exciting and disheartening. Exciting because of the energy and intensity of our effort, our friendship around it, and the vibrancy of the debate sparked by our work, which was in turn a part of the nearly society-wide debate in the US, not just on who lost or did not lose Russia and where it could be found, but on the related context of neoliberal globalization and the international economic order. The sad part of this story is the lost opportunities for peace, justice, and democracy, as Peter's human rights movement and its ethos were pushed aside and its remnants ended up criminalized by the Putin regime and largely pushed out of the country. Peter's warnings of the early 90s about the perils of unconditional American support for the so-called reformers were dismissed by policymakers until it was too late. The purveyors of neoliberal reforms, who made fortunes promoting them in Yeltsin's and early Putin's Russia, and whose predictions failed while Peter's came to pass, have kept control over the narrative and access to decision-making through all the twists and turns, their influence way bigger than Peter ever had, while the opposite is true for those who shared his concerns, and some of those who did, like Stephen Cohen, are also no longer with us. I was 23 when I first met Peter in his office stacked with rare publications and early 20th century posters. It was after my first 9 months in the US. I had just run away to Washington from a fully funded PhD program because it felt too removed from the action that I was seeking, that is, to help amplify the voices of Russia's democratic opposition to the Chechnya war. I was also looking for ways to change my J visa, to bring my family, including my little son, to the US. I was calling up unfamiliar people in my halting English and getting outraged that no one had a solution. When calling Peter, I was at once more careful and more hopeful than with others, because his name was among a handful of Western scholars whom I discovered in the Tamizdat emigre publication secretly brought into the Soviet Union by my mother on her trips to Western Europe. Peter was not just one of the few friends and defenders of the human rights movement against its Western skeptics, but also one of its most perceptive and subtle critics. Thus, in his preface to the Uncensored Russia, he noted that, quote, "The democratic movement is middle and upper middle class. It has so far said little about the economic rights of workers and peasants." Peter graciously offered me work and with the kind support of Jim Millar, a visiting scholar status. I was amazed by Peter's warmth, serenity, and kindness. His deep understanding of how resistance to oppression in Russia worked, his rock-solid humanistic values, and his affinity with what is still called the intelligentsia, the term that has been unjustly debased since then. Like a true intelligent, Peter was totally free of the social class bias. Peter, Betsy, and their network of extraordinary friends, including Carl Linden, Bob Otto, and later James Billington, became my second family. Peter initially tasked me with research and then with drafting chapters, first in Russian, then making me switch to English, an opportunity to learn to write by immersion. Soon we agreed to change the book's focus, from nationalists to the entire Yeltsin rule in a global context, to explore the causes for the resurgence of nationalism. Peter let me write a large part of it and infuse the drafts with my observations from inside of the Democratic Russia movement. Only much later, from my recollections of his Socratic questioning, I started to grasp the purpose of his doing it. He was not just giving me a voice and a once-in-a-lifetime chance to analyze and to express what I saw and knew on the subject to a worldwide audience. By doing it, he was amplifying the messages coming from the unprivileged part of the Russian society and of the base of its democratic movement that I was at least to some extent able to transmit. It was akin to what he had done for the dissidents in the 70s, letting them speak directly from the pages of his books, which gave that special authenticity to his writings about them and to his own role as a dissident in his field. Researching and drafting this book was my part-time work that enabled me to study in a doctoral program at SAIS while working there as well and to bring my family over. It all ended after my application for funds for a dissertation on the Soviet human rights movement was turned down. Due to personal circumstances, I had to return to Russia, just days after our joint article was printed by the Journal of Democracy and debated at NED. Over the next year and a half, I was writing up and defending my dissertation in Moscow on another topic, and alas, no longer able to work with Peter as closely as I wished. When our book came out, I traveled to its main presentation at USIP on a business visa, but could not stay for other presentations or sit down and respond to the reviews that were popping up. On that trip, I sensed that some of the most invested in the Russian market of politics as consultants to the government and firms were viscerally hostile to our critique of the reforms, while paying lip service to our book's merits. Anatoly Chubais, the architect of Russia's transition from oligarchy to autocracy and the key middleman between Putin and the West, as well as oligarchs themselves, their proxies and clients, were building their influences on K Street and Wall Street, buying silence about Putin's war crimes in Chechnya, placing or promoting their cadres in key institutions, while seeking to block their rank-and-file immigrant critics from any visibility. I had scant idea of the extent of their and their enablers' power or vindictiveness, and was bound to discover it throughout my professional journey. Still, I believe that the analysis and the warnings we provided, and the debate that it stirred up, were worth the price paid in terms of lucrative career opportunities. I came back as a permanent resident in 2003. Mr. Putin had just been feted here by politicians, financiers, and fossil fuel lobbyists. Peter was retiring and tried as hard as he could to help me out at GW and other places. I shared with him my observations that the few dissenters from Russia's new order that I saw seeking to establish themselves in the US were being discriminated against with the help of and in favor of the agents of Russia's so-called elite. Peter did not disagree. Around that time, he wrote in the Washington Post, warning Wilson Center and the Kennan Institute that they were selling their integrity to the Russian oligarchs. Long story short, I decided that my purpose, previously pursued through my joint work with Peter, should be carried on by setting up organizational networks for post-Soviet immigrants to help them assert their presence and relevance in our society and in some of the policy debates, while also bringing more attention to the human rights crisis in Russia. Thus, Russian-speaking Community Council was founded. Let me conclude with the following about Peter's legacy. His deep contextual knowledge, grounded in empathy and undiluted by personal or corporate material interests, accounts for the accuracy of his long-term forecasts. Peter proved to be right on three major accounts, each time challenging the near consensus in his field. First, about the possibility of Soviet collapse, that he predicted as early as in 1967 in London Times. Second, in his preface to the Uncensored Russia, where he foresaw a repeat of 1917 in the second half of the 20th century, with Russia first winning and then quickly losing its liberty. And third, in his 1999 testimony, warning that Russia may soon become yet again an anti-Western rogue state. Given this record, let us keep in mind what he wrote about the post-Putin's future. 19 years ago, in response to those who viewed Mikhail Kasyanov as a potential successor, Peter wrote that Russia's next leader is more likely to be a hardline nationalist. As discouraging as it is for some exiles today, claiming that Putin's exit would create an opening for its free and beautiful future, and indeed as disappointing as it is for myself, this last among Peter's predictions is likely to come true as well. Thank you for your attention.
Right, we now have a round table with 4 members. Yeah, round table, like in the flat. And each of them will speak for about 8 minutes. Yeah, Bob, okay. Yeah, so you want to speak from your seat? Is that okay? Yeah, okay, all right. And then afterwards, we will open the floor for questions. Let me just say the discussion will be about Peter Reddaway's legacy. And of course, one thing that has not been mentioned, in my view, sufficiently is the book, The Tragedy of Russia's Reforms, which is really his magnum opus, is really what he devoted most of his time to, and that really became this really great outcome of his many years of analytical work about Russia. And so maybe there will be a chance also to talk about that, right? And the term, for example, market Bolshevism or market Bolsheviks, which has not been adopted, which has actually been suggested by Peter, but which has not really been accepted by the profession afterwards. So we start with Catherine Dale from the United States Institute of Peace, and the floor is yours. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you, Peter. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. It is a genuine honor to join all of you at this symposium to reflect on and pay tribute to Peter Reddaway. Warmest thanks to Henry and the Institute for including me in this event and for hosting all of us. Peter was my professor and my boss, and then he became my mentor and lifelong friend. My thoughts may be personal reflections more than academic ones. I arrived at the George Washington University in the fall of 1992. I'd just spent a year in St. Petersburg watching the Soviet Union fall apart. Peter was looking for a research assistant. I was looking for a job. So that's how it started. I had a reasonably good grasp of Russian at the time and an undergraduate degree in Slavic studies, but I think what really sold him were my stories of standing in long red lines and undertaking, for reasons I cannot recall, a massive remont of my flat that I was renting on Litini Prospect, and all of the characters I met along the way who were grappling with this collapse of this thing we'd known for so long. Also, I was a certified baker of chocolate chip cookies, and Peter loved cookies. That may have clinched the deal. So Peter took me in for a few years, and just before he began the great stories we've just been hearing, we were based here at George Washington at the same institute, but then we were located in Gelman Library, I think on the 6th floor, and Jim Millar was the head of the institute. Peter's office was a thing of wonder. Shelves on every wall, stacked, filled, crammed with amazing and sometimes rare materials in Russia and about Russia. Peter actually read them, which was impressive. We got to spend a year also at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Peter was a Jennings Randolph Fellow there for 1 year. I joined him. That was 2 USIP locations ago at 1550 M Street. And it was an extraordinary time. Galina Starovoitova was also a fellow that year and a close partner in crime. Crazy time to be reflecting on what Russia was, right? The tenor in this town for everyone who lived it was exultant. Ding dong, the witch is dead. The end of history has arrived and we've got the formula for you. It's shock therapy and sending our own civil society over to rebuild yours in our image. What's not to love? But Peter's instinct was a little bit different. He was, as we're hearing from everyone, far more open to possibility than that easy formula or recipe would suggest. So what he saw, as many of us know in those early days, was cause for concern as well as jubilation. For most Russians, and many of us lived this, many of you lived this, for most Russians, after all, the world had just fallen apart. Yesterday, right, I was a citizen of a superpower, and today, I have no idea what happens next. What many experienced was a profound feeling of loss and uncertainty. And so political entrepreneurs stepped in, eager to take advantage of that disaffection and even hurt. Peter and I dove into a world of nationalists and ultra-nationalists and the crazy Zhirinovsky, and a world of, no kidding, far-fringe fascists, among others. And to be absolutely clear, Peter was not and was never betting on them, let alone advocating what they had to say. He got accused of that at the time. But he was just taking seriously the complexity and contingency of the times. So he made a number of trips to Moscow, and he used to go for long runs along the river well before anybody else in Moscow was doing that. That's changed. But he met with people and talked with them and listened to what they had to say. So he got to know Alexander Plekhanov, right? The editor of Zavtra, this nationalist publication and a big advocate for restoring empire. They did not agree, but they had very lively exchanges there for a while. Peter also got to know Alexander Rutskoy, right? The vice president, who was increasingly disaffected at the time, and we all are familiar with the standoff that led to in October of 1993. A common theme among Plekhanov and Rutskoy and others, right, was this dissolution of empire and what that meant and how wrong that was. And so we, they were lamenting this loss of empire, so we followed their interest. Rutskoy took a lot of interest in Abkhaz separatists, right, who staged a military action to separate Abkhazia from the rest of Georgia. As we tracked all these nationalists and others, Peter was also very interested in how their ideas might be resonating with Russians. And so we partnered with the US Information Agency, USIA, those were the days. And we also worked really closely with Yuri Levada himself and his really wonderful team at Symposium to craft a survey exploring Russian support for authoritarian views. No surprise, there were some. But what Peter saw through all of these channels of observation was not that Russia would necessarily revert to authoritarianism or take any other course, but that it could happen. The path forward was not yet set in stone. And those views were not popular at the time. Everything was clear. But as we see all too clearly today, he was onto something. Peter's impact on my own thinking and, frankly, my life has been profound. And as I reflect on his legacy, what I am struck by more than anything is his incredible thoughtfulness. And that's true as a scholar and also as a human being. He listened to people and took them seriously. And that was true of opposition figures of all kinds, regardless of the kind of regime or leadership that they were opposing. It included disaffected Russians. It certainly included the dissidents that we've been talking about during Soviet days this morning. He understood that history is contingent, that opposition views just might turn out to matter. And so if we fast forward today in the context of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, there's a curious debate in this town. Should we be talking with Russians at all? And should we be talking with Russian opposition people? Because their views may turn out not to matter. After all, Putin's in charge, things are set, and other voices don't matter all that much. They'll never have an impact. That strikes me, and I think it would have struck Peter, as a failure of imagination. Russia's future history has not been written yet. Someone's going to shape that future. Why don't we do all we can to support powerful voices for peace? At USIP, we're working with a number of Russian exile communities. We host a Russia Hands discussion series, and you're all welcome to come and be part of it, where we grapple with what Russia is and where it might be. And then sometimes, quietly, we bring Russian exiles together to talk with Ukrainians. In fact, we're doing that right now this week in a wonderful project called Brave Generation, courageous young people who have grappled with real trauma but are willing to talk with each other. One of our speakers this week was the extraordinary Oleksandra Matviichuk, the Ukrainian Nobel laureate. And she told them, we shouldn't give up even when all we have left is our voices. I'm sure Peter would have agreed with that. And so, Peter, for your mentorship and friendship and your example, I think all of us are very grateful. Thank you.
Very much. Next speaker is Bob Ortung, George Washington University.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you very much, Henry, and the team for organizing this event. So, like many of the speakers who've already spoken and probably ones to come, Peter was very much a mentor for me too, and he really shaped the way I think about Russia from very early on in my career. So around 2000, the Carnegie Corporation of New York very graciously invited Peter and me to lead a program which would study the evolution of federalism in Russia, just as Russia was moving from the Yeltsin era into the Putin era. And this was part of a much bigger project that was studying the overall transition in Russia, but we were looking at the federalism piece, and that resulted in 2 rather thick volumes of prose analyzing what happened during that time. So at this point, of course, Peter was already a distinguished professor, had a long and solid career in publishing and that sort of thing. I was young and made up for the lack of erudition by too much self-confidence, I would say. But for the project, we visited many cities in Russia, including Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, Kazan, Pskov. And Pskov was particularly memorable because we were taken on a tour of a monastery there. And unfortunately, as we listened to what the guide was saying, Peter became very frustrated. And after a few minutes of listening to a bunch of nonsense, he decided to take over the tour himself, explain the whole history of the monastery, what happened there, and everything else that we needed to know about religion in Russia and culture and et cetera, et cetera. And so we all learned something new, I would say, from that experience. We also organized a couple of conferences in Russia. And so at that time, Russia was quite a wild place, and it was easy and possible to rent out suburban resorts and use them for academic conferences. So we did that a couple of times. And the only problem was that you had to pay in cash. And so, of course, Peter thought we were dealing with the Russian mafia, which may or may not have been the case. But I was living in Brooklyn, so nothing fazed me at the time. And luckily, Peter was working with his colleague here, Suzanne Stevenson, who many of us remember, and she was able to get the money for us, make it all happen. And so since coming to work at GW myself, about 10 years after I worked with Peter, I've come to realize that it's much easier to work with the Russian mob than it is to work with the GW bureaucracy. So unfortunately, that's the situation I'm dealing with. But anyways, the project gave us a lot of resources, thanks to the Carnegie Corporation, to bring together a sort of a rising cohort of young Russia scholars who are now established scholars. And of course, that group included Henry and Gulnaz. They participated, but also many other folks like Peter Rutland, Nikolai Petrov, Natalia Zubarevich, Elizabeth Wishnick, Brian Taylor, Tamila Lonkina, and Judith Twigg, a lot of people who are now established scholars themselves, but were relatively young back in those days. And so at that time, of course, federalism was a very hot topic in Russia. Yeltsin had made it possible for the leaders of Russia's 89 regions to be elected directly by their own populations. And so when I was working in Prague at the Open Media Research Institute, which was affiliated with Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, and then also in New York City at the East-West Institute, we were tracking the developments of what was going on in the Russian regions very carefully and in great detail. So there was a strong interest then in the Russian regions among scholars, diplomats, and business people. And they were looking at an evolving, rich tapestry of peoples, cultures, and possibilities. So, just going outside of Moscow, you could see this great, amazing society developing in the post-communist era. And of course, at that time, there was a strong debate whether or not this new political freedom would last, whether Russia would evolve into a democracy or return back to the authoritarian roots. So our 2 books that Peter and I published together trace the early stages of Putin's ultimately successful efforts to centralize both political and economic power, once again in the Kremlin, and minimize the autonomous power of the regions. So, of course, many people at the time had thought that once democracy had been granted in Russia, it would be impossible to move backwards. And at a minimum, many felt that the Russians would fight for their freedom. But that obviously is not what happened. So even then, though, and this is 2004, 2005, things were happening too quickly for our book-length analysis. So after we had put together a volume that was pretty much the size of the Market Bolshevism volume, that thick, Putin announced a new reform where he created the federal regions and appointed 7 super governors whose job was basically to control the 89 elected governors for each region. So we ended up adding a postscript to our already massive volume. And I just wanted to read the last couple of paragraphs from that postscript just to give you a sense of our thinking at the time, back in 2005. So the overall conclusion to this postscript is that Russia is now firmly embarked on a path toward an authoritarian state in form as well as substance. We believe this path to be a dead end. Officialdom has become a closed, non-accountable caste that calls to mind the Soviet nomenclatura so vividly described by Michael Vaslansky, was mentioned earlier, a quarter century ago already. The three branches of government are now virtually unified and only formally separated. The fourth estate has lost its freedom to reach a wide public and is withering or going underground. And business is recognizing its restrictive dependency on the state and the need for still more bribery. None of this means that people seeking various forms of political freedom have disappeared in Russia. They are going underground or onto the web to plan for the future. Meanwhile, the lesser political freedoms can still, as in many authoritarian states, be exercised without too much impediment. So I think it was thanks to Peter's deep understanding of Russia and his clear-eyed view of what was happening there, particularly with the government, that allowed us to produce that kind of analysis that still holds up today and is not embarrassing to go back and read 20 years later. So I'm very grateful for Peter for that.
Thank you, Bob. Okay. Our next speaker is Robert Otto, United States Department of State.
And I'm enjoined to tell you that what I say here today may or may not be the view of the Department of State. If I had to describe Peter's career, I think I would just say, in a short way, I would say something like bright colors, bright, bold colors, no pastels. When Peter took a stand, you knew where it was, and he always defended it ably. Peter was also a historian by training, and as all good historians know, history doesn't have a side. There is no glass, half full or otherwise. And you don't analyze countries in terms of a predetermined path because, as our previous speakers have said, history is contingent. Leaders and populations make choices, and these choices are, Peter felt, always needed to be evaluated within the circumstances that they occurred. I also would like to quote some words here because they provide a nice frame for the first two books that I'm talking about. While a close examination of Yeltsin's record belies any claim that he was a true Democrat, what we can say is that he was more tolerant of media criticism and, significantly, more inclined to trust his own ability to mobilize forces to achieve an improbable victory against strong opponents than Putin has been. That wasn't Peter. That was Henry Hale, our host and his successor in patronal politics. When I read that, Peter came strictly to mind as soon as I read that passage, because back in the 90s, there was a belief that Yeltsin was, in fact, committed to democracy. You could make a case that US policy towards Russia was predicated on the assumption that he was bringing Russia on a democratic path. Peter just didn't think so. In fact, from a certain point of view, the evolution of market Bolshevism is an indication how sometimes things can be contingent. I met Peter in 1990, here in this building. There was a professor named Stephen Carter who wrote a book about Russian nationalism. At the time, I was at DIA, and I was already interested in Russian nationalism in the Soviet Union, in part because of John Dunlap's work. John and Peter were friends, so we got to strike up a conversation and a relationship just based on that. When Peter first started to think about doing this book, it was going to be something that he called the hard right. Now, I don't want to mimic him, because I can't, but Peter had a very unique way of saying the word hard. There was at least 3, perhaps 4 letter A's in between the H and the R. At any rate, by the time of the 1993 parliamentary assault, Yeltsin's assault on the parliament, Peter decided that it was not on a democratic path, and what he wanted to do was to sort of chronicle what was going on with the Yeltsin from top down with market Bolshevism. And market Bolshevism, perhaps it didn't catch on in a widespread way. But his basic idea is that this was no different from what the Bolsheviks had done in 1917 by imposing a top-down system without necessarily even trying to explain it. In fact, one of the things that I remember Peter clearly stating, that when Yeltsin had choices in early 1991 after the coup whether or not to do political or economic reform, and went with economic reform, one of the things he never did was to explain to the population in what Peter called the blood, sweat, and tears speech. In other words, Yeltsin always made the population think that these kinds of things were easy when they were not, in fact. Anyway, this was a hard thing for Peter, the whole book project. Betsy will remember this well. He had his ups and downs with it. Catherine can probably talk a little bit about this. Dima certainly can talk about a bit about this. There was a time, in fact, where I, playing devil's advocate, and I think Betsy remembers this, decided to sit him down and just say, look, why don't you abandon this project? It seems to be causing you more agita, I'm an Italian, upset stomach than anything else. Well, very quietly, but quite firmly, he almost took my head off. And to this day, I can remember what he said. This is a matter of honor. I will finish this book. And ultimately, he did. Now, as for the legacy, I'd just like to give a couple of anecdotes. I had a younger colleague, although at this point in my life, all my colleagues are younger. But without prompting from me, I brought Peter's book to me and told me that this was the best thing that he had ever read about the 1990s. He was only vaguely aware that I knew Peter, but I swiped the book that he had and had Peter sign it, much to his delight. Secondly, there is a website called Riddle. It's run by a Russian emigre named Anton Barbashin. It publishes articles in both English and Russian and then translates them. One morning, I get up and I'm reading an article by Jeff Hahn. And while I'm reading it, I'm thinking to myself, my God, this is Peter's. This is what Peter said. I don't know Jeff Hahn. He's apparently in London. But a couple of days later, I'm scrolling through some of the people I follow on Twitter. I won't call it the other thing. And I ran across a tweet by Kirill Shamir, who is a Ponars member and whom I vaguely know. And I wrote to him and asked him and said, you know, your friend, Joe, he was promoting Jeff's article. Your friend should read Peter's book. And I got back an email saying Peter's book inspired it. And happily, I was able to tell Peter this at our last lunch. In June. Anyway, that agony of the first book was not present at all in the second, and that's the book that Peter did on the Siloviki War. In some ways, this book flowed from the first because the term Silovik or Siloviki or men of force, people with shoulder boards, began to gain a certain currency at the end of the Yeltsin period, but really took on a new dimension once Putin came to power. There was a famous article written by Olga Kristianovskaya and her friend Stephen White about the militocracy, people in shoulder boards. And of course, Kristianovskaya also played an important role in highlighting the persistence of the nomenclatura, which Maria was talking about this morning and which filtered into Peter's first book. The other reason we wrote the book was because, and truth be told, is because we were wrong. Peter and I, dead and thoroughly wrong about the issue of Putin's staying power. When Putin first came to power, both of us didn't think he'd last much longer than a year or two, but he did. I never used that phrase for fear. But in any event, what we did was decided that since his leadership style was so different from Yeltsin's, Peter decided to try to examine it. And the book is organized around the fact that the security services were all fighting each other. Now, in this, was Putin a referee? Was he the manipulator? Was he the arbiter? Or was he just a bystander? Or perhaps, maybe he was all three, depending on a particular period that the war was going on. And Peter examined this. In contrast to the first book, this was a rollicking good time. I can't tell you how much fun I had going through this stuff with Peter. Many exchanges, sending him articles, back and forth, this, that, and every other thing. So much fun that we actually thought about doing a sequel because we got more information on some of these conflicts and the Siloviki War didn't end, it continued. But as the great Lenin once said, and I'm talking about John, not Vladimir, life is something that happens when you're busy making other plans. So we never got around to it. Instead, he wrote The Dissidents. Oddly enough, it's my favorite and it's the most personal for me, despite the fact that I had absolutely nothing to do with it, in contrast to the other two books. I came, as I mentioned, I met Peter in 1990. I knew all about his work with the dissidents, but the whole time I knew him, I never had a conversation with him about it. We just never talked about it. There was the press of other developments. But going through this book, I began to see the person that I so much almost adored. He was never mean-spirited. Never mean-spirited. In the 35 years that I knew him, I don't remember him saying a nasty thing about any person in particular. Now, of course, he had some nasty things to say about people's arguments, but from that point of view, that's fair game, and he always made a distinction between the sin and the sinner. Secondly, the devotion and dedication. Whatever else you might want to say about the dissidents, I'm not talking about the book now, I'm talking about the people. Peter's devotion and dedication to bringing their cause to light had an impact on how people in the West understood the Soviet Union. Now, it is certainly arguable that the dissidents themselves had nothing to do with the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. But I would argue it's also equally beyond dispute that they brought to light a good deal of the pathologies and the rot that afflicted that polity that led the Communist Party leadership in the 80s to try to change things. So, that kind of behavior towards other people, I came to understand was a piece with the same matter of honor that he talked about in terms of finishing his book. So as I said at the start, bright, bold colors, no pastels. Or as we used to say back in the Bronx when I was hanging out in a pizza shop, what a guy. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Professor Gulnaz Sharafuddinova from King's College in London.
Oh. Yeah. Thank you very much. I was fortunate to be Peter's doctoral student, and I should note that, yeah, maybe it's hard for me to explain the type of relationship between me as a student and him as a professor and a teacher and a mentor. Maybe the number one characteristic of it was respect and very healthy boundaries and respect for my own research and my own work, so much so that the boundaries have grown for various reasons, institutional reasons of the type of research that is prioritized in political science that took me away from Peter's more historically founded, historicist, and very, Peter is a model of scholar activist, something that is becoming more and more important now. And the institutional pressures have led us towards more positivist type research. And the other one is, as I was looking at the latest exchanges we had with Peter was from 2020, just around the COVID time, where he had his latest invitation to visit him and Betsy, and I didn't use that invitation, which I'm now very regretful about. But the COVID times brought these double pressures of hybrid world, and then after the COVID hybrid plus the face-to-face pressures have just increased the work requirements, and my own personal sort of life story of being based in two countries and raising kids and professional career made it hard to maintain the linkages that that of course makes me now regret it. And yet from that distance and from these boundaries, I want to reflect on the value and the legacy of Peter's work, whose relevance and timeliness is extremely miraculous, I would say, and certainly a huge achievement. Again, in the context of the institutionalized political science that we have today, because Peter and we, the type of political science that he argued for and that he very eloquently defended in his book, The Tragedy of Russia's Reforms, is the political, or area studies, he referred to it, is attention to history, attention to nuance, elites, context, values, morals, and it's really sort of quite a pleasure to read this book again, but this book we first covered in my doctoral courses, probably it was the fall of 1999, and the book came out 2000, or it's dated by 2001, so probably the book did not yet exist then in its current fashion. But now looking at it, 25 years after it came out, the 90s, the main subject of this book, looked at through a very scathingly critical perspective that laid out the fault lines of authoritarian modernization, seem extremely insightful today. Later on in my own book, The Red Mirror in 2020, that came out in 2020, I wrote about how the 90s were important as the foundation for legitimating Putin's regime, and how the whole historical memory, or the recent historical memory of the 90s, was mobilized politically and made use of and resonated so much throughout the 21st century. But in many ways, Peter and Dmitry really lay out a very early critique of these 90s in this book. And it's interesting that, political opposition, and starting with Navalny himself, his own reassessment of the 90s in prison that was now built on through Pevchik and FBK's own work through documentary Предатели about the 1990s. Again, 24, 25 years after this book, the whole subject is being reignited. Is very controversial among the educated, well-to-do intelligentsia, or well-to-do middle classes or upper middle classes of Russian origin, who have very, different views about the 1990s. And again, in striking contrast to this very critical view that Peter and Dmitry have developed in their book. Now, the 90s and the necessity for reconsidering and rethinking through what went wrong in the 1990s could be argued that might not be the subject for today when the war is ongoing, but certainly will be an important subject to consider once if Russia returns on the path of change and reintegration into the global world. And ideas expressed and developed with meticulous research into personalities, into specific individuals, into their political interests, incentives, motivations, and values would be really, really important. And so revisiting this book, I think, would be really important in that context, just to understand what that context was. Now, the 90s is one important trajectory, but if I were to bring in two other trajectories of Peter's research, one with the dissidents and Crimean Tatars, his attention and activist involvement with Crimean Tatars, once again, is extremely pertinent today in Russia, that is clearly in need of big rethinking in terms of its imperial or racist tendencies, societal tendencies that where ethnic inequalities, racial inequalities, social inequalities have come right now very much onto the surface of the big problems that used to be and for many still represent blind spots in the Russian sort of societal texture. And once again, Peter's work with this specific group of the Soviet society then seems very pertinent today. From that perspective, from the decolonial perspective, from the how the Russian state and Russian society have existed and perpetrated ethnic inequalities and wildly presumed sort of hierarchies of ethnicities in Russia that, of course, now are very much felt in the war and in specific expectations about Ukrainian nation and sovereignty. So that's another thing. And more generally, through the prism of his work on psychiatry, on medical psychiatry that focuses on human rights, that brings us to the subject of just what is democracy and what democracy is about. And again, in this book, there is a nice theoretical discussion about what were the visions and concepts of democracy that were prominent and popular in the 1990s with the minimalist versions, the Schumpeterian versions. And Peter's work on human rights, quite maybe tangentially or not quite directly, I'm linking it, but brings to my mind the observation from Guillermo O'Donnell, an Argentinian political scientist who worked a lot on democracy and democratization issues. I think in 2011, there is a book he wrote. He was writing it for more than 10 years. He shares in the preface. It's called Democracy, Agency, and the State, or maybe State, Democracy, and Agency. Democracy, Agency, and the State, it's called. And in that book, O'Donnell, who is a political sociologist, who was shaped by his experiences in Argentina, authoritarian Argentina, as well as his experiences in democratic United States, shares his observations about the blind spot in the definitions of democracy and brings attention to the concept of political citizen or political citizenship as agency that is not considered in commonplace definitions of democracy that are very much institutionalist. So by bringing attention to the concept of political citizens as an agent, endowed, born into democratic system with legal safeguards for the citizens' rights and obligations, is something that's taken for granted and not at all integrated into a vision of what democracy is. So that vision of political citizen as an agent is sort of a blind spot, but it comes up from the concept of human rights that are then legally defended in the system. And this is the subject that hasn't been quite discussed in the 1990s in Russia, as the Russian elites and Democrats were focusing on economic reforms, political reforms, parliaments, etc., 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 but just human rights and legal defense for political citizenship. Individuals who know and can see themselves potentially as presidents of their country, practically, right? So it's not just a voting that you are allowed in a democracy. It's that anyone born, my son was born in the United States. When I took him to Russia, some relatives of mine looking at him said, President, you can be a president. Sort of, Amerikanski president. There was a joke, but it's not a joke. When you live here, you born in the United States system, you can think about your children potentially as parliamentarians or presidents or whatnot. In Russia, anyone born, do you think they are able to think that way? Right? But because the legal safeguards, the legal defense of specific rights that are expected in a democracy are not there, are not conceptually integrated and shared in the society. And one of the potential problems is because it's a blind spot. that's not sufficiently discussed and shared as a common knowledge. And Guillermo O'Donnell brings attention to that. And Peter Reddaway substantively worked on human rights that did not exist in the Soviet system. And of course, that conversation and that subject will have to return into discussing if Russia has a future. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. I want to say just before we open the floor for questions that one feature that I actually get from your contributions, all four speakers, and that I remember very well from having met Peter in the early 90s and then having been particularly actively involved with his work in the 90s, not so much afterwards, was that he was never afraid to actually stand by himself, even when he was completely alone in his position, and defend his position and insist on his position. You know, I've seen this also in TV programs, for example, in discussions where he was invited and so on. He was not afraid to be the one who differs from everybody else. So he was, in this regard, really an individualist, and I have to say, I admired that. I found this to be a position of real strength, of real individual pride also. But it was not really a matter of kind of self, confirmation and affirmation or something like that. It was really because this was natural Peter. He was really not afraid to be, in a position of a complete minority, even a minority of one. And that was quite a remark about him. Anyway, I want to first of all thank our four speakers and then open the floor for questions. Sir, please introduce yourself.
My name's Matt London. Thank you. Hello. Yep. Matt London. I have a question about the 90s, and I apologize if the answer is to just read more of Peter's books. But I'm curious. I know he had it in for Tobias, and I'm curious, what did he, if he did, say was the alternative? I mean, was he suggesting Zyuganov in 96? Did he like Zorkin? I mean, there were not great options. I spent a lot of time in those years in Moscow. I thought just surviving to the next day was a victory. So my question is, what did he see? Did he look to Poland or other countries or other people? And there's one final, I mean, was he critical of a guy like Gaidar and sort of thought that, geez, that just put us on the track to Putin, late Putin?
Yes, I'll just read one of the name of one of the chapters. Tanks as the vehicle of reform, the 1993 coup and the imposition of the new order, right? I think the title of that subsection, right, already tells you that if there is a dedication, commitment to democracy, tanks cannot be the vehicle of reforms. In a sense, and of course he's bringing attention to the September-October clash between the parliamentarians and the presidential office that then led to not only the tanks but also new constitution, and the new constitution that also potentially in some republics, in some regions, there was a fraudulent referendum. So it's about the methods of implementing reforms. That's where the criticism is. But also another open criticism that comes up early on is that Russia is the only country where president was not replaced after shock therapy, after a period of painful reforms. And now we can look at what happened in 1996, and there is a lot of research and debate and thinking about who is responsible and how the 1996 reform presidential election was held and how Yeltsin won, right? So those two elements, those two historical 1993 and 1996 understanding about what went wrong and how the actions and choices could have been different, and how they subverted democracy for the sake of sort of authoritarian imposition of modernization, the way that they would claim it.
I think I would challenge the premise of the question. It's not really an issue of what he was for in the sense of an alternative political force in Russia. It was more an issue of correctly evaluating what was happening inside the country. And unfortunately, there were too many people, in my view, and certainly in his view, that were looking upon Yeltsin as an agent of democratic reform, when it's arguable that he was not an agent of democratic reform. Now that I'm an old person at these kinds of things, I can say that I still have a lot of friends who study Russia. Some of them are in academia, who think that when Yeltsin left power in late 1999, he left Putin an unconsolidated democracy. At this point in my life, as I say, I'm prepared to accept that if, and only if, my correspondent will agree that at the same time, with equal justice, you can argue that Yeltsin left Putin an unconsolidated autocracy, and that it was very easy for Putin to pick up the threads and get what we got today.
Thank you. I loved your answers. I share Bob's view. It is not always true that there are good guys in the mix. It is for Peter. It's about, and it's about always challenging yourself to better understand the complexity. It was so comfortable with the premise that you've got to make the problem harder in order to understand it. And that's something that I and maybe others have taken from working with him.
And also, I'm sorry, I'm just remiss. I should have said in my initial presentation, Gulnaz is being very modest because she did not mention her work on crony capitalism it was published in 2010. The kinds of economic policies that happened during the Yeltsin period actually fostered anti-democratic attitudes.
Yeah, I just thinking back my memories of Peter, and he was always talking about the lying and the bribing, like the corruption. And I think he kind of stood on a more moral ground. So it wasn't so much that he supported one group or another group in Russia, but it was this constant evaluation of the politics from a moral position, and that if you took out the lying and the bribing and the corruption around it, that would create a better system and hold the people in power more accountable. I think that was really what he was after there.
Okay, more questions, please. Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Chris Bort. It's kind of a testimonial. I was Peter's COTAR, that stands for Contracting Officers Technical Representative, when he was a visiting scholar with us in the intelligence community. And I went through some of the same developments of thinking that Bob Otto described in terms of what Putin represented at the time. Peter was like a giant among us, an intellectual scholar, just always gracious, always thoughtful. And I will never forget how he outmaneuvered me in predicting that Yeltsin was going to resign early. And of course, this was anathema to some of us political experts who thought we knew better. Peter was picking up on signals from Alexander Shokhin and others who were thinking that Yeltsin might step down early and clear the way for his chosen successor. And of course, oh, that's nonsense. Come on, Yeltsin's going to stay there until the bitter end. He might even manufacture a way to go forward. And then it came down to we had to make a call. And just at that moment, wouldn't you know, I got sick. I had this fever and I could not come into work. And that was the day that Peter encouraged our people to produce this report on Yeltsin leaving early. And I was like, Peter, that's crazy. Why'd you do that? Anyhow, the rest is history. So thank you, Peter Reddaway, for all you did.
And thank you, Chris, for being sick.
Hello, Kathy Kosman. I'm interested in exploring further the effect of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975 in Peter's thinking. At the time, or shortly thereafter, I worked for the Helsinki Commission, and we translated all the documents, not only of the Russian, or I should say the Moscow Helsinki group, but also that of the next most active Ukraine, and that was the most repressed, the most and earliest repressed, also in Georgia and in Lithuania. So, you know, I know the title is Russia, but still it would be helpful to expand the horizon a bit. And Peter certainly did, because I consulted with him at many points. Thank you.
I think I have to apologize because you're dealing just with a bunch of Russia geeks.
No, but you're right. I mean, his work was on the Soviet Union and the diversity of it. I tried to underpin with the Crimean Tatars, but it's not only that, but, you know, he was exactly looking for those groups that, and just his approach was not to look at what's, you know, very visible, but to look at what's under the upper side of the iceberg, below this invisibility, trying to understand what's behind. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you, Ekaterina Klimenko, Canon Institute. Thank you so much for the panel and for the event. And my question is maybe a bit philosophical. Why do you think this is still so difficult for a lot of people in academia and journalists and commentators to see the roots of Russia's current predicament in the 1990s? Why is it so difficult to reevaluate Yeltsin and his circle and his legacy? And in particular, I would like to unite the two thoughts that Gulnaz mentioned, decolonial perspective and the 90s and authoritarian roots in the 90s and war in Chechnya, which is, in my view, the beginning of everything that happened afterwards. Why was it so easy to overlook the war in Chechnya back then? And it's so difficult to look back again at the war in Chechnya that was started by Yeltsin, the first one, right? And to see the roots of the problem there. That's my question. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. I'll start us off and see who else wants to leap in. It's a great question as we look back at the 1990s, how we think about that. And I was reflecting on two things. There are younger generations today. We're hosting at the Institute of Peace this week, young Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians who were not alive then. It's history. They've heard from someone else or their parents, and that's one piece. But for those of us who lived the 1990s, part of this is simple. We were wrong. You know, we were wrong collectively. And those of us who raised questions and looked and had quiet conversations, for example, in Bob Otto's kitchen across the river, looking at things and puzzling through this, were in a very small minority and didn't win the argument. History went rolling on and had a powerful impact. Because arguably, and to connect some of the threads, including some of Gulnaz's remarks, right? It's not just policy at the leadership level in Russia. It's what this meant for Russian people to see us coming in and supporting this thing that made life 1,000 times harder. And what in the world were we thinking?
So it's a great question as we look back. How do we, how do we grapple with that, and where does that conversation happen? And it's probably pretty darn important as we look at ourselves and think how well we're doing, understanding where we are today. I'll stop there.
Yeah, to give a quick answer to you, Katya, is that it's hard to see problems coming from the 90s because the stakes are very high for those generations that put so much hope, energy, resources, succeeded, opened up, transformed. For them, it's very hard to look at that as a problematic decade. So the stakes are very high. It's much easier from the younger generation's perspective to look at it, from the distance with high boundaries, neutrally, the way Pevchik does it. Her career, life is not at stake when she does it, but someone like Kisilyov or those who we see very provoked and extremely negative about the whole documentary, of course, for them, there is a lot at stake. And then the questions come, what are the alternatives, right? As if there are always just two alternatives. It's either here or there, but there are gradations, right? But this dual or bipolar type juxtaposition is very frequent in those who try to defend and say, and they have their rights as well. Just like, upper generations or older generations look at the Soviet experience and try to limit and forget out and black out the tragedies because they have lived their lives. They had, so sort of, I think there is generational issue, and a little later it will probably be easier.
I was going to say having lived through the 90s myself too, as a Russia expert, it was a very, complicated time. And for all the bad things that were happening, there were also interesting and good things that were happening. Russia was becoming free. People were able to talk, and, it was different. So economically, it was bad. If you remember, everyone's favorite phrase at the time was, it's easier to take a bowl of, or an aquarium and turn it into a bowl of soup than to take a bowl of soup and turn it into an aquarium. And that's, basically what was happening. Russia was going from being a bowl of soup in the Soviet Union to an aquarium now, and it's obviously going to be a very difficult time. And the other point, if we take Peter seriously, the whole thing was contingent, right? So it didn't have to turn out the way it did. And Peter had foresight in seeing a lot of the negative things. I don't know, I was young at the time too, and I remember being very, sometimes, disturbed by Peter's pessimism all the time. And he always focused on the negative. And I thought, well, look, this time, I remember explaining to my professors, in grad school, this time it's going to be different. Of course, that was wrong, but, that's youth, and there's that hope that things will be different. So I don't know.
I would note that December 11th, 1994 was actually the start of the first Chechen War. So there's a certain symbolism to your raising the question. Yeah, today. 30 years, good God. One of the things that Gulnaz says, I think, is important to think about. And it's the reaction to the Navalny post and then the Reddaway video, the traitors, where the Navalny team takes a really, really hard look at the 90s and the reaction that it produced. For the 90s, for some Russians, it was a good time. These are the people who look back at Navalny as their voters. This was a time for democracy, or at least the start of democracy. It was, you'd have to be an idiot not to understand that there's a huge difference between Putin's Russia today and Yeltsin's Russia in the 90s. In terms of free expression and all the rest. For a lot of intellectuals, this was a great time. One of my favorite pieces of all of the things that I've read over the course of the last 35 years is a small little essay that Yevgenia Albats wrote in Moscow Times in 2001, where she goes over the reasons why she thinks the Soviet Union collapsed. And she said, those 3 days represented hope, and the hope has come to nothing. But I can't believe, I honor those days, and I was glad that I was a part of it. And throughout the 90s, we had any number of people, and, you know, let's be fair, Chubai spoke good English, and that kind of thing. And it produced an impression on people.
We have a question online.
We do indeed. The question is, what was Peter's attitude toward opposition leaders such as Ilya Yashin, Kara-Murza, and others who were recently released? Did he feel, as many do today, that they needed more lessons in decolonization and are too forgiving of ordinary Russians for their responsibility for the war against Ukraine?
I never discussed that with Peter. I don't know.
Okay, then maybe there's another question.
Hello, I am Zarina Sautiva, visiting scholar here at the Elliott and also a democracy fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. So it's not a question, and it's mostly like a reflection on what was just said. Because like, you know, during my 2 years here, I heard a lot of times that Yeltsin was a Democrat, and there was like Russians were granted democracy, etc. And my question, and maybe partly question, is about like which part of Russia was granted this democracy? Because I was born in Ingushetia in 1992. After 2 months, after my birth, part of my family was forcibly moved from the Prigorny district to Ingushetia. A lot of them lost their houses, and like Russians and all other people call it the event that happened in 1992, Ingush-Ossetian inter-ethnic conflict. While we do not consider it as ethnic conflict, we consider it as ethnic cleansing, because Russian army and Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs was part of these events, and their tanks were there, and there's Russian soldiers were there. So, and then in 1994, the war in Chechnya started. So everything I remember from my childhood is a lot of people who didn't have homes to live, a lot of soldiers, a lot of military equipment. Then in like my teenagers years, all about counter-terroristic operation in my region. So a lot of people tortured, a lot of people left because they couldn't live there. And now when, you know, only like 10 years ago, we just started to think that maybe it's gonna be some kind of like bright future for our region. But then the invasion started, and now we are thinking about how to save our men, how to avoid the conscription, etc. So when people say here that Yeltsin was a Democrat, for us, it's like, it's a little bit humiliating us. So I just wanted to reflect on it. Thank you.
I think if Peter were here, he would agree with you.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much for attending this event. Thank you for the organizers. Thank you for the 4 speakers here for sharing their memoirs and memories of Peter and their thoughts about his legacy. So thank you very much.
Dispatches of photo of our panel?
No.
Dispatches from Kalashnikov, Professor. Are there still no more?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And thank you also very concretely for all the help putting this together, because the process for us of learning, you know, how extensive Peter's networks are and how many people touch in ways which we kind of do to some limited degree, but the degree to which he kind of brought in really pretty astounding. So part of the process of putting this together was an education in its own right. And certainly we could not have done this by ourselves. So thank you so much. And I also want to thank Kelly Stevenson and the IRE staff for doing a lot of work putting this together. Again, work like this involves a lot of preparation, I want to thank them and thank all of you for coming. And I think this kind of all joining in this discussion to honor Peter just by your presence and by the discussions that we'll have. And hopefully we continue these discussions in lots of different formats and connections that people can make to continue his legacy, which I really find very inspiring in so many ways. So I think maybe you can leave us with that, and that can take us into lunch reception, which we'll have kind of right outside. So we have the room for at least another kind of 45 minutes or so. So please feel free to stay and enjoy it for as long as you like. And again, thank you all.